The webinar will begin in about 1 minute. Hello, welcome to the final webinar of the National Consortium's Telehealth Resource Centers HACK series. My name is May Kwong. I'm the Executive Director at the Center for Connected Health Policy, the federally designated National Telehealth Policy Resource Center. Today's topic for our webinar is behavioral health services and early intervention. Next slide. Please know that any personal information that you provided today for our webinar, it will not be shared. We will keep that information private. Next slide. National Consortium of Telehealth Resource Centers is comprised of the 14 telehealth resource centers who are funded through a grant program through HRSA. There are 12 regional resource centers that cover specific states and 2 national resource centers, one on policy, which is CCHP, and one on technology, which is located in Alaska. All 14 telehealth resource centers work collaboratively together on joint projects and events. Next slide. For those of you who attended the HACK series when it was hosted by ASPR in the summer of 2020, the series transitioned over to the Telehealth Resource Centers in October of 2020. Next slide. A couple of tips and notes for today. Please know that your phone or computer microphone has been muted. If you have a question for our panelists today, please use the Q&A function. The chat function should only be used for technical issues regarding Zoom. Attendees are able to adjust their video using Zoom's sliding feature, and know that closed captioning is available today for today's webinar, and you'll see that button on the toolbar below. The webinar is being recorded, and a recording of the webinar will be available a few days later on the National Consortium of Telehealth Resource Centers YouTube channel and our webpage. Next slide. A couple of disclosure policies that we do have to share with you. Continuing education credits are available today. It is being hosted by the University of Arkansas Medical Center. This is their disclosure policy. Next slide. Staff that worked on this. Next slide. And the joint accreditation and credit designation statements. If you have not asked for credits, continuing education credits before for a previous telehealth hack webinar hosted by the TRCs, please know to access and get your CE credits, you will need to create a profile on Learn on Demand. This is the Learn on Demand website and the steps on how you would do that. You only need to create the profile once. So if you have already created a profile, you do not need to do that again. Next slide. And the certificate will be offered through the Learn on Demand system. So you would just go in, look for this particular webinar, fill out the applicable portions, answer the questions that they ask, and then you should be able to receive a certificate. Next slide. Please note there is a deadline for the CE credits. So you must go into that Learn on Demand system and request them and fill out the proper forms and answer the proper questions by April 7th. This is a hard and fast deadline. So you must do this before April 7th or by April 7th in order to receive CE credits for this webinar. Next slide. And we really emphasize that this is a hard, fast deadline. So April 7th, you must get your information in order to receive your CE certificate and your credits. Next slide. So for today's agenda, we are in for a treat. We are hearing from Dr. Susan Elswick. And as always, our webinar today is going to be moderated by Dr. Christian Ramers. Next slide. So for those of you who are not familiar, Dr. Ramers is the Chief of Population Health and Director of Graduate Medical Education at the Family Health Centers in San Diego. That's a large federally qualified health center serving nearly 200,000 medically underserved individuals throughout San Diego County. He is board certified in internal medicine, infectious diseases, and addiction medicine, and is particularly interested in HIV, HBV, HCV, and service of medically underserved immigrant and refugee populations. So I will now turn it over to Dr. Ramers.
Thank you so much, May. And if we could go to the next slide. Thanks everyone for being here for our final Telehealth Hack 2.0. It's been a great series, and really special thanks to May and Aria and Samuel and all the NCTRC staff for putting these on. We do have a treat, as May said. Today's final discussion will be on behavioral health for an early intervention in a virtual world. And it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Susan Elswick. If we could go to the next slide, I think, for her bio. So Dr. Elswick is an associate professor in the University of Memphis in the School of Social Work. She has over 16 years of experience in clinical mental health that includes community mental health, case management, residential programming, ABA and school-based programming, parent coaching, integrated behavioral health, infant mental health, and home-based services. Dr. Elswick is an LCSW in several states, Mississippi, Tennessee, and Arkansas. And she's a licensed school social worker in Tennessee as well. She's also a national trainer and supervisor for a number of evidence-based modalities and trauma-based interventions. So I'll turn the microphone over to you, Susan, and look forward to hearing our talk today.
Hey, thanks so much. I appreciate you having me. If you'll go to the next slide. So really what we're talking about today is when COVID-19 hit the nation, many clinicians, including early interventionists and infant mental health specialists who typically do their work face-to-face with caregivers, really were thrown for a loop because we were asked to start providing service delivery in a tele-behavioral health practice model where we were not familiar or had not had experience in the past. So the purpose of today's training is really to give an overview of what to expect, how to prepare, and ways in which to engage families in these early intervention service delivery models, including the behavioral health pieces of practice. Next slide. So we're going to focus on, troubleshooting common barriers to telebehavioral health services and practice. Also talk about some new skill sets that may be utilized in early intervention services with caregivers as you're working through those behavioral health needs. And also talk about attunement. How do you create attunement in a virtual world? How do we gain that connection, that relationship that many of us are used to experiencing in face-to-face service delivery? And then we'll also talk about a few evidence-based best practices that I've actually adapted beautifully to the telehealth model. Next slide. So when we think about how to set up telehealth practice, we'll go to the next slide. There are some things that we need to kind of consider as clinicians or providers prior to getting started. The very first thing is to realize that we don't necessarily change the types of interventions we're doing because of telehealth practice. We still need to be guided by evidence-based best practice, and we'll just have to slightly adapt certain things to that virtual platform. But we are going to still follow those specific protocol and the fidelity of the intervention while also somewhat adapting to this virtual platform. So we need to be able to manage natural environments. No longer are we able to kind of control what's happening in that clinic session because we're not in proximity with the caregiver and the child to be able to do that. But I do need to be aware of the environment in which the family is conducting the session. So are they at home in the playroom? Are they in the child's bedroom? Or are they actually in the living room? But I need to be able to identify what's happening in that natural environment and use it and utilize that as part of the intervention in practice. I do need to feel comfortable with being able to document how I utilize these evidence-based best practices in a telehealth framework. Because I'm going to follow that with fidelity, but I also need to be able to indicate what were some of the differences or maybe even challenges in doing that virtual style of intervention. We definitely have to be flexible. I think many of us over the last year have learned how to be flexible because we were kind of thrown into that concept of being flexible in the moment. We'll talk about some of the common barriers. One of the biggest things is what if the kid takes the phone or the technology and they're walking through the house and, I'm getting seasick as a clinician because I'm trying to navigate what the child's showing me. So we're going to talk about some ways to kind of navigate some of those things. But oftentimes going with the child, going with the caregiver, letting them lead the session sometimes can be very helpful and assist with being flexible in practice. Understanding how to utilize technology. Currently, there is no requirement especially in the state of Tennessee, for you to be certified as an e-social work therapist or a virtual therapist in order to provide virtual service delivery. However, having training in practice of telehealth programming, whether that's through an online module or some type of training through a university, and lots of hospitals also offer e-certificates or intervention-based telehealth certificates. So those are some things to think about. It just helps to prepare you for that model of practice. We also need to kind of consider the legal considerations. You need to be aware of what your state standards are for your specific license. When we're talking about early intervention services, it's not just licensed clinical social workers, it's speech and language therapists, and it's, ABA clinicians, behavioral health consultants. We need to understand what our licensing and the laws are in our state as it relates to our ability to provide service delivery to the families that we're serving. We need to also ensure that the technology we're using is HIPAA and FERPA compliant. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And also check your state's standards on liability insurance that will cover your practice as it relates to telehealth. I know the National Association of Social Workers has offered additional riders on liability insurance that covers telehealth practice during this time. And realize that state to state, these requirements are different. And so it's definitely important for you to investigate that if you have not already. And then finally, understanding clinical roles. What is my role in the telehealth programming? What is the caregiver's role? And what are we really expecting the child to do in the therapeutic intervention? That is a discussion that needs to happen very early on in your intervention during intake. We really need the caregiver to understand what telehealth looks like. We also want to utilize some initial assessments to guide our service delivery, not just clinically, not just assessments about what the caregiver is needing, what does the child need, but more globally, even around their digital literacy capabilities. Is this caregiver comfortable with doing telehealth? Are they worried about it? Do they have access to technology? So we need to start embedding those types of questions and into our intakes to prepare families for this type of service delivery. Being ready to troubleshoot. Technology is not 100%. And so there will be times where there are going to be technology issues, whether that's on your end as a provider or on the caregiver's end as the client. And so during intake, we need to discuss what's the plan if technology stops working. Are we going to jump on the phone? That's a fine solution. But you're going to let the caregiver know what that plan is in advance so they don't feel stuck, so they don't feel as if they've been lost in that intervention. And then understanding whether or not the caregiver even likes tele-behavioral health. Is that something that they're open to in getting that service delivery from you? Next slide. So as I mentioned, assessing the caregiver's digital literacy, how comfortable are they? How frequently do they use technology in their daily lives? We really want to incorporate those types of assessments into the intake. Common Sense Media, you can Google search this survey, has a wonderful survey and questionnaire that can be easily adapted if you don't already have a digital literacy assessment tool to use. It could be very easily adapted to use in your intake, and it just asks, what access to technology do you have? How frequently do you use an iPhone? Do you have a technology and internet that's going to work for you, or do you constantly have difficulty getting that internet to work? So we're going to ask these questions on the front end to really try to troubleshoot any of those issues that may come up. Also, being prepared to help the caregiver feel comfortable. Maybe they've never used this type of platform before. They're not comfortable with it. I'm going to do a kind of an initial session where we're just going to practice it. It's almost like a role play. I'll just tell the caregiver we only need to like 5 or 10 minutes, and why don't we just practice logging on, see how that works for you, and let's troubleshoot any issues. So doing those kinds of things prior to your very first session with the caregiver and the child will make sure that you're breaking down some of those barriers or fears that the caregiver may have about using technology in practice. Next slide. So the equipment that we need, you really do need a computer, iPad, or iPhone, and that's the same for the caregiver. They need to have access to some form of technology to participate in the service delivery. High-speed internet is definitely going to make your life and the caregiver's life much easier. They need to have access to a webcam, microphone, headsets for certain situations. If I am working with a caregiver and a child at the same time, depending on the evidence-based intervention I'm using, I may not want the child to hear what I'm telling the caregiver. So the caregiver may need headphones so that I can kind of coach the caregiver through a specific situation without necessarily impacting the relationship that the caregiver and the child has in that moment. But there are times where I need the child to hear me, or that intervention doesn't include headphones because I want the parent and the child to interact together, and I want to be able to communicate. Identifying and locating a room that would be beneficial for this caregiver to use when you're doing telehealth sessions. This is such an important piece. And this will be something you have to consistently remind caregivers and talk about for a couple of reasons. One, we want it to be distraction free. We want to be able to get as much of the child and caregiver's attention as we can during the session. And if there is a lot of stuff going on in the room where we're attempting to do therapy, that's going to make it slightly difficult. But also, I want to make sure that the child feels safe. So maybe I'm working with a kiddo that's 5, 6, and I really want to do some one-on-one work with that child. Depending on the environment in which the child is sitting when they're receiving those services will depend on their level of interaction with me. Again, because of distractions, but also confidentiality. Maybe the child really wants to talk to me about something that happened between her and mom, and she doesn't feel comfortable doing it if mom's listening. So depending on the age and the type of intervention that I'm doing, it really will depict what room in that house or in that environment would best benefit the intervention that you're using. Next slide. So also when we think about what platforms, there are many telehealth platforms that could be utilized, and I wouldn't say one's better over another. We just need to really make sure that we're focusing on the fact that the ethical and legal considerations of the platform that we are using. So you definitely want it to be HIPAA and FERPA compliant. If you're like me, I do school-based service delivery, so it's not just the HIPAA piece of it, it's the academic FERPA piece of things as well. I want to make sure that that system we're using covers both. And many of these platforms that you may already have, maybe it's Microsoft Teams or Zoom for Healthcare, you just want to make sure that you have what they call a business associate agreement on file with that specific organization. And that is what's going to protect you and ensure that they're maintaining that HIPAA compliance for the system that you're using in telehealth practice. So the one that we use in the SMART Center at the University of Memphis, which is the treatment, intervention, and research training program we have on telehealth practices in behavioral health, we use Zoom for Healthcare. So that has been the platform that we use. But here locally, in our large school district in Shelby County Schools, they actually use Microsoft Teams. So both of those platforms are completely fine. And you just need to find one that works for you and fits into your budget. That's another piece to think about, budget-wise, what the cost will be for you as a practitioner in using these intervention services and platforms. Next slide. So when we think about what are the skill sets, the skills that are necessary or needed in order for us to be successful in telehealth practice, really understanding that we're just going to kind of follow the caregiver's lead, especially in behavioral health services as we're doing early intervention programming. I need to have an idea of what I'm going to do because I'm using an evidence-based practice, and I'm going to follow that with fidelity. But there are times where the caregiver may need something different in that moment in time. And so we need to be flexible enough to follow the caregiver's lead during that intervention. We also want to make sure that we're using the environment in the session as much as possible. If I'm doing early intervention services and I'm trying to work with a caregiver and a child with attachment needs, I want to make sure that I'm using the environment. What toys happen to be available in the environment, or what activities can the caregiver and child do together that will increase and enhance that opportunity for positive serve and return and attachment in that home environment. Also engaging the family, we need to know, what does the child like? What kinds of toys does the child already have access to? What are they drawn to? What do the caregiver and child like to do together? Maybe they enjoy baking. Maybe they love sitting and reading books. So during your intake, you're going to take in that information so that you can utilize it in your intervention. We also need to be prepared to pace our sessions. I need to be able to stop midway through the session and just ask the caregiver, are we getting to everything that you wanted to talk about today? Am I answering or addressing the needs that you have in this current moment in time? I don't want to be too fast paced because that actually may make the caregiver somewhat anxious or overwhelmed. And I don't want to be too slow paced because then the caregiver may stop being attentive, or it may feel more like a chore than it is supportive. We also need to be prepared to help the caregiver manage any challenging behaviors that may be displayed during these sessions. And that could be as simple as helping the caregiver understand why this behavior may be occurring. So maybe the kid's done. They're done sitting still. They don't want to sit any longer and they need to get up and move. And so it may be coaching the caregiver through that. Oh, it looks like Sally's done. Let's stand up with her and let's take a little walk. Okay. So it's really helping the caregiver to think about, what is this behavior that the child is displaying? What is it trying to tell us? And what can we do in this moment in time to address that specific need of the child? And then documentation. We need to be prepared to be able to utilize our documentation system to identify things that popped up during that telehealth session, or things that might have been challenging, or how I had to adapt the intervention. But we always need to stay consistent with what were the goals, what were the objectives, and where are we in that treatment plan process with this family. And just remember that actual telehealth experience at this point is not a requirement. However, before you start your very first session with a family, you need to have some experience and exposure to using technology. So one of the things we do at the Smart Center is it's a training center for students, graduate level and undergraduate students, in preparing them for using telehealth practices in the field. One of the things we do before they ever are assigned a client is they actually have to practice what would happen if technology stops. So they have to role play through with a specific peer. What happens if I'm in a room that's too loud? How would you manage that as a clinician? What would you do if the technology shut off? How would you focus on getting back connected with that caregiver in that moment in time? So before we have our interns and our students jump into therapeutic practice, we want to prepare them for all of those pieces. And so we do have them do a series of role play and training exercises prior to starting those service delivery. Next slide. So let's talk about the benefits of telehealth. Next slide. When we think about telehealth practice, it has proven to be effective for a number of diagnoses and for a number of needs across the lifespan, not just for young children, but even for adults. But we do know that it is an effective practice for children that have developmental delays, including motor delays. So a lot of physical therapists utilize telehealth practices, and it works beautifully. Feeding disorders, attachment disorders, behavioral disorders, sensory processing, autism spectrum, and even hearing loss and speech and language needs. Now, when we think about autism spectrum disorder, I do telehealth programming. Most of the time when I'm working with children on the spectrum, I'm working with level 1, level 2 kids in a virtual platform. Now, if the caregiver is present, absolutely, I can work with a level 3 kiddo because the caregiver is present and they are actually assisting the therapist. The therapist is assisting them in doing the intervention in that moment in time. But a level 3 child with autism would have a very difficult time even engaging at all in a telehealth model with just the therapist present. However, a level 1, level 2 kid, we actually do a lot of service delivery in the community where we utilize games such as Minecraft, and that's actually the intervention we use. It's a social skills intervention where Minecraft, the game, is basically the conduit to getting kids to communicate and interact and problem solve. And so within this Minecraft world, the children are given an activity that they have to complete during the group session, and the therapist is in attendance, and they're basically coaching them through those social situations that are happening in a virtual world. So when we think about how can technology be adapted to use for certain diagnoses or disorders, you can be super creative and still use your evidence-based best practices in the moment when you're doing these types of programs. Next slide. We also understand that the benefit of telehealth services is I actually can see the child and the caregiver in their natural environment. Many times if caregivers come to the clinic, they often say, well, my kid doesn't act like they do at home when they're in the clinic. And that's true. We call it reactivity. right? So the child's in a different environment. There's somebody else in here with mom, so I'm going to act slightly different. And so being able to see the child in the natural environment where the behavior or the needs happen to occur actually assists us as therapists in being able to guide the caregiver through an intervention or through a solution for a specific behavior. It also gives us an opportunity to include other family members. When we think about skill generalization, again, if I think about all the kids that come to the clinic, we're able to get stimulus control in the clinic, right? So the kid's behavior improves in the clinic. Even the caregiver is doing really great in the clinic, but sometimes that skill doesn't generalize back to the home environment. And so what we have found is that actually using telehealth practices has actually assisted with skill generalization, because we're actually able to incorporate more family members, go to different environments and try these interventions with the caregiver and the child. Also, we can participate in the daily routines that are often seen in the home environment, like potty training or feeding or even playtime with the kid. Sleep, like laying down for a nap, which often is sometimes a really difficult thing for some caregivers to get their child to do. So we can actually be part of those daily routines and assist the caregiver with maybe even setting up more consistent routines for those specific situations. You may have a caregiver that's just, I don't really want to be on telehealth. I don't want you to see my home. I don't want you to be able to see inside my house. And there's a lot of reasons families may feel fearful of using telehealth programming. So I'll often start off with, let's do some phone sessions. But if you could you maybe record you and the kiddo, in some type of daily activity or reading a book or engaging in a play activity. And then they share the video recording with me where I can give some feedback and provide some support and use that as a video modeling intervention to get the caregiver a little more comfortable with what it might look like to be live on the camera with me in the session. It also helps to break down those barriers to service delivery. We are breaking and taking away those barriers of transportation and scheduling issues that many caregivers have when they're trying to put therapy into their schedule. And then it also gives us an opportunity to see the behavior when it's actually happening. And that's been a very powerful piece for me, is to actually see the behavior or the needs that the caregiver has been describing in that environment, and where I can actually assist the caregiver with regulating so that they can co-regulate with their child in that moment. And then also we know that it increases parent self-efficacy and their belief in themselves, that they're able to manage and handle that specific situation with their child. Next slide. All right, so let's think about some creative ways to engage children and families in sessions. Next slide. When we think about what is our goal, in early intervention services specifically, our goal should not be to gain the attention of the child. Our goal is to work with the caregiver to gain the attention of the child. So really, I'm working with the caregiver to hold the child in order to be able to do the service delivery. So sometimes I think in telehealth service, we'll say, well, the kid's 2 years old. I can't keep their attention long enough on the computer to do therapy. Our goal in early intervention services is to work with the caregiver to engage the child. And then we're going to have to be flexible. You're going to have to adjust your time. When we think about developmentally appropriate ways to provide support, the kiddo's probably not going to sit for 20 minutes in front of a computer while we're doing service or intervention. And that's where that flexibility comes in. We might have to be willing to follow the kid if they went into another room, maybe going with them or asking the caregiver, let's go see what they found. Or if the child's picked up a toy and brought it back, let's use that in therapy. Let's engage them that way. And then children really are what we call digital natives. They grew up in an environment, most of them, that have access to technology, and they can use it better than we can. So using the technology to your advantage and engaging the child and the family through technology-based games and activities can also be a really great way to keep the child engaged during the session. Next slide. So when we think about, we talked about kids really are familiar with technology. So video therapy is something that they're probably going to be slightly drawn to anyway, because they're encouraged by technology. They want to hold the technology. And we'll talk about that in a minute, because sometimes that could be a problem in early interventions. The kid wants to hold the tablet or the phone, and sometimes that can distract from the intervention. But, it doesn't always have to be about technology. It doesn't have to be about me sharing a screen and the caregiver and the child interacting with an interactive coloring book. You could totally do that. But you can also continue to do your typical types of therapy in this virtual space. So one example is do a family scavenger hunt. Have the family go around their home and identify things that make them feel safe, or something they really like to do with the family, or maybe an item that represents the family to them. And so during the scavenger hunt, you're basically just along for the ride. And then they're going to give you their feedback about what the item is, what does it mean to them, how does that represent what you were asking them to find. But it doesn't always have to be this stagnant telehealth is sitting in front of a camera and not moving. It doesn't have to be like that. And really, to engage families, we need to use more kinesthetic movement. Next slide. This is just an example of that family scavenger hunt bingo. The link that was in the previous slide will take you to this free downloadable version. And it's just a fun game that you can do that will engage the caregiver and child together. It'll increase opportunity for attachment. It also improves the serve and return interactions, and it gives you some insight into that family's dynamics. Next slide. Also, you can do, depending on the age of the child, and you can engage the caregiver and the child in a specific activity. There are times where maybe there's something that the child and the caregiver need to work through. And so I know, in like if we're thinking about a play-based activity, I might think, okay, maybe if we built the house and we talked about what are the roles and responsibilities of each family member and how does that child feel like they fit in, and we can do activities where you can either send materials to the caregiver, which oftentimes I will do that. If I have a scripted intervention that I want to use in the next session, I might send them materials if they don't have access to those materials. And I usually will ask the caregiver, I'm planning on doing an art activity with you next week. Really would love to send some things if you need it, but we're going to be using markers and pencils. And so I'll just gauge, does the caregiver have access to that? And then if they don't, we do ship that material. And I am lucky enough that I'm grant funded and can afford to do that. But a lot of these things can be done just with resources that the family has in the home environment. But this is a scripted play intervention to just get the family thinking about overall the home environment, the dynamics in the family, and it also gives them a play setup. So maybe we're talking about the kiddo following directions because maybe they really struggle with that. Not only is this a play-based activity they can do together, we can use it in the intervention, okay? And so that script will just tell you the materials that you need and how to conduct that specific play-based intervention in practice. Next slide. Also, we want to make sure that we continue that service delivery beyond the therapeutic session. So beyond our session with the client, where we're sitting in front of the screen and interacting together, I want the caregiver to continue to use these skills in between sessions. And so oftentimes I will ask caregivers to do what we call special playtime. And for those of you that have been trained in child-parent relationship therapy or parent-child interaction therapy, you're very familiar with special playtime. And all that is we're asking a caregiver for 5 minutes a day to sit down with the child and to play with them based on the way the child wants to play. So we're teaching that caregiver basically to do play therapy, to be a play therapist. We do teach them certain skills. We'll ask the caregiver to not ask questions during special playtime, that it really is just child-centered. We're focusing on the child. We're letting the child lead the play. We're given positive reinforcement through labeled praises. I really like the way you're sitting still. Thank you so much for sharing that item with me. So we do teach the caregiver certain skill sets, but then we ask them to participate in these special playtime to enhance that skill development, but also to continue to engage that family and serve and return interactions, and also to kind of continue to build that positive rapport and attachment that the child and the caregiver may need. I do work with some caregivers that really struggle with play. They really have a difficult time remembering how to play. And that's for a number of reasons. It could just be because they're super busy and this feels like an additional thing they're adding into their day. What we often find is that caregivers that struggle with play were not provided that level of play when they were a child. So they really just don't know how to engage with their 3-year-old in a play-based activity. So again, there are times where we will do what we call prescriptive parent play, where I might prescribe an activity for the caregiver between sessions, and it basically tells the caregiver step by step how to do the play activity. So it kind of takes the worry out of it for the caregiver. They don't have to worry about, am I doing this right? Is this the way I'm supposed to play with my kid? Is this strange that I would play this way? It's a scripted intervention that sometimes will decrease the anxiety level that some parents have about playing with their child. And again, we also may want to identify, are there developmentally appropriate toys in the home? Because if not, then that too may be something we want to look at, is what could we adapt in the home environment that could be considered developmentally appropriate, that could be used in that play setting. Or, if I, again, have the funding to be able to do that, we do send home prescriptive play therapy boxes that have developmentally appropriate toys in the box. And it also has play cards where it describes to the caregiver different ways to use that play item throughout the week with their child. I also developed a series of bibliotherapy techniques for caregivers. And it's completely free. If you click on the link that's provided here, you can download any of those that you want to. But it's just common children's literature like Llama Llama Red Pajama. So, and it is a scripted intervention that follows the book, and it enhances social emotional learning and assists the caregiver with talking about things like anger and frustration and happiness and sadness. So it really builds that emotional literacy piece, not just for the child, but it also gives the caregiver tools in order to teach those specific skills. And the template actually has play-based interventions that the caregiver can do that match and fit with those specific books. So that's something, if you want to download those, you can definitely access those for free. And then last, we kind of talked about sample videos. I would love to see what your playtime looks like. If maybe you really struggled with that last activity, or maybe the kiddo really got dysregulated. If you want to take a video of that and send it to me, then that will give me some insight into what I can do next time to help coach you through that. So a lot of times I will ask caregivers for videos if they feel comfortable doing that and sharing it, so I can use it in therapeutic practice. I might even use it with the caregiver in the next session. I might start playing the video and say, Mom, you did such an excellent job. Look at this. Kiddo got upset. You patted him on the back and you told him that you knew he was sad, and he calmed down. So like, I'm going to use that video in session to reinforce the caregiver skill sets. Next slide. Also, we talked about using technology to our advantage. There are a ton of different apps that you can use, as well as technology, like games that are already developed online that can be interactive and be used through these virtual platforms. So go ahead, and you don't have to recreate the wheel. Like there's one activity that I do with caregivers where it's a spinning wheel, and it's got facial expressions on it and feelings words, and they can tap the screen. So I can give them remote access. They tap the screen and the dial will stop on a specific feeling or emotion. And then I just ask the caregiver and the child to play that out. What would it look like if you were really sad? Think about a time that made you really sad. Have you been sad in the last couple of days? So it's just using technology that already exists to enhance your session. Also, I do a lot of what we call direct instruction. I will show the caregiver a specific skill. The caregiver and I will actually do it together, somewhat like a role play. And then I ask the caregiver to show it to me using their child as the part of the intervention. So it's called I do, we do, you do. So the caregiver may not feel super confident on the front end, addressing a tantrum behavior. So I might want to use direct instruction model so that they feel more confident and allows them the opportunity to role play in a safe situation. So when the actual tantrum occurs, the caregiver is more prepared to manage it. Also, we talked about using those objects in the environment. If the kid picks up a book and that wasn't what the mom wanted the child to do, we just roll with it. Oh, Mom, why don't you ask her to open the book up? What's inside? She really wants to look at that book. So we can totally roll with it. And we want to encourage the caregivers not to feel stressed that the child has to sit still for 20 minutes and listen to Dr. Elswick. That's not the point. The point is for us to be with the child and with the caregiver and be flexible enough to move with them. I also want to make sure that my voice is, appropriate for the specific situation or setting. If the caregiver is real amped up and anxious, I need to really relax my cadence. I really need to relax my voice. I want to help to bring that caregiver down to where they feel more comfortable and calm. Maybe I have a caregiver that's really low, right? They're really flat affect and they're not really engaging with the child the way I need them to or would hope that they would. Then I might need to increase my pace or my intonation. I might need to get the parent hyped up a little bit. So using your voice, because we can't really use a lot of other things because we're in a virtual platform. So your voice is a very important part of the intervention. We also want to make sure that we're praising the caregiver and providing that great feedback. And what you'll notice in virtual service delivery, there'll be times where the session feels like it starts to lull, or like the caregiver is starting to lose interest, or they're starting to have difficulty staying, sustaining attention. If you start really focusing on giving behavior descriptions of what the parent is doing and labeling, you're doing such a great job keeping him engaged. Oh, look at him, he really enjoys playing with you. That actually will increase that parent's interaction during that time. And there are going to be times where activity level drops. So be ready to kind of offer some suggestions, whether that's, if the energy level is really low for the parent and the child, let's do some movement activities. If the child's really hyped up and you can tell it's making the caregiver anxious, we might meet the kid up here with that hyperactivity by doing some movement activities, but then we're going to do another activity that's going to bring the child's energy level down so that it's assisting the caregiver too with managing those feelings and emotions of the child in a healthy way. And then, of course, I use my own props and toys. A lot of times I will use my props and toys on my end of the screen, whether it's puppets or different activities, to engage the child if they seem to be, dawdling or not engaged. So you can always do it where you're using the things you would do in play therapy practice in your clinic room. You can do those in that virtual platform also. Next slide. All right, so some of you might be interested in how do you create a virtual platform, a virtual playroom for your kiddos. Actually, if you click this link, it takes you to a wonderful YouTube video where they specifically explain how to use Google Slides to develop a virtual platform. And so what you basically do is you screen share this Google slide, and it's interactive hyperlinks. So like you see the word Uno on the bookshelf, if the child goes, I want to play Uno, and they touch the Uno cards, it will open up a hyperlink that takes you directly to a web page where you can play Uno together. There's a Jenga board where if they click that, it'll take you directly to that web page where you can play interactive Jenga. And depending on the platform that you use, the platform that I use, I can give screen share and I can give remote access, which means that I take a turn and I touch the screen and I'm able to pull out a Jenga block. Then I can share the screen and remote access with the caregiver and the child, and they can take a turn and pull a block. So that does depend on your platform and the accessibility that you have. But doing it this way allows the child and the caregiver to have choice in what activities they may want to do virtually. So again, if you're not going to use the home environment the entire session or ask the caregiver to bring specific play toys to the session, you can always start off with your virtual playroom and allow them to kind of engage and interact that way. And there are a ton of things like feelings thermometers where I might do a check-in with the caregiver and they can tap the screen and tell me where they are on a 0 to 10, 0 being I'm pretty calm and things are good, 10 being it's been really intense today. But even the child can engage because the facial expressions will pop up on the screen and the kid can pick that specific emotion that they're feeling at that time. Next slide. All right, we're talking about attunement, and we'll go to the next slide. And what really is attunement and how it can be a really difficult thing to be able to accomplish in a teletherapy space. However, really attunement is just the clinician's ability to present to and with another's expression and their current experience. And so we want to be able to relate to the client, and our client is not just the kiddo, our client is the parent and the child, and ensure that they feel safe in that specific environment. And so next slide, we're going to talk about how do you create safety in a virtual program. Now, when we think of initially talking about those digital literacy, that's number one. You have to see what level of comfort the caregiver has with technology. That's going to make them feel safe. Remember how we talked about doing that prep call where, we're not even having session today. I just want to call in and I just want to see, let's walk through what it looks like to start your session up. So when we have session later this week, you're not frazzled or upset because you can't get the link to work. And so even doing those early initial steps of prepping them for that can decrease their stress level and make them feel more safe. Also, I do often a check-in and check-out procedure in every telehealth session. We do a check-in, like where are we today? 0 to 10. Is it a thumbs up day? Is it kind of rough? And then I do another check-out at the end of the session because I want to know after the session is over, is the caregiver feeling more regulated? Or are they feeling a little bit more intense than they were when we started? And that gives me the ability to kind of gauge my interventions. I do want to make things predictable. So I want to have a routine in therapy. I want the caregiver to know what sessions will look like, but also be able to be flexible enough to move with the caregiver and the child if I need to. I also have a video that I send to caregivers on the front end that just talks about what is teletherapy. Also, it gives them a tour of my therapy room because I do still use my therapy room in virtual practice. And I just want them to understand what is therapy. So if the child is old enough, we even have a video that says, you're going to see a play therapist. What is a play therapist? And it explains that in the video to the child. Also beginning kind of with the here and now, helping to ground that caregiver in the moment so that they can feel more connected, not just to the session, but to their child. And then also helping the caregiver to identify specific things that may calm the child down if they're overstimulated. So creating a therapy box or a sensory box with the caregiver that they can use in those sessions. I do a lot of screen share where the child can touch the screen and interact, the caregiver can touch the screen and interact. And then I use a lot of sensory and movement activities during my sessions. And then oftentimes I was just working with a family the other day where the kid said, I don't want you looking at me. Like you watching me makes me nervous. And so I said, that's not a problem, kiddo. I can turn my camera off if that makes you feel better. And so the kid was like, yeah, and this was a 4-year-old. So I turned the camera off. And at first the mom was like, that's rude. Don't say that to Dr. Elswick. I'm like, no, thank you so much for telling me that it makes you nervous that I'm on here. So I turned my camera off. And within a few minutes, the kiddo was like, can you come back and play with us? Absolutely. So it's creating that feeling of safety and understanding for the family. Next slide. Also, we want to make sure that we're setting rules and expectations for therapy. We talked about creating predictability, how important that is. And, we just need to remember kids can't stay on Zoom for an hour. They just can't. So we're going to have to adjust the lengths of our sessions. Maybe I start off with the caregiver and talk about their needs and concerns. Then we bring the child into the session and work together. And then we let the kiddo go, right? Because it's been 25 minutes and they need kind of a break. And I need to spend some time with the caregiver, re-regulating the caregiver or asking them how it went. What did you think went well during this session? What kinds of things do you still have concerns about? So understanding that you're not going to engage this kiddo, this 3 and 4-year-old in an entire, 1-hour session. It's just not likely to happen. Role-playing activity. So if the kid steps out of the room, I can still work with that caregiver. We can role play. We talked about using the share screen as a way to kind of break up the monotony. And then there are times where kids just need a break. So I do offer the opportunity for kids to take a break in the middle of session. If they're getting overwhelmed or they're done, they can give me a sign or a symbol that they're going to take a little mini break and then come back. And there are behavioral ways to do that using break card procedures. But, scavenger hunts, wiggle games, those kinds of things are going to assist the child with staying regulated. And then also we want to make sure that we are assessing in every session the progress of the client. So being able to use those rapid assessment instruments in your telehealth session is important. Next slide. Now, when we talk about best practices in early intervention in behavioral health, I'm only going to talk about a few because there are many that can work well and have worked well in telehealth practice. Next screen. So when we think about the ones that have worked really well in early intervention, I think about child-parent psychotherapy, parent-parent relationship therapy, and parent-child interaction therapy. Next slide. Now, those of you that are not familiar with CPP, it is an evidence-based intervention that was developed for ages 0 to 5, really focusing on dyadic interventions with the caregiver and really enhancing the attachment for that caregiver and child and addressing any kind of specific stressors or trauma that have existed. And I'll give an example. Working with a caregiver who lost her husband in a significant car wreck where she and her children were present. And so in therapeutic session, that's what we're working on, is the trauma that they all experience of losing their dad and their father in this wreck. And this has been one of those interventions that beautifully adapts to telehealth. I really kind of wondered, how is this going to take away from the attunement piece of this type of intervention, but it works beautifully. And so if that was the trauma, then what I want to make sure I'm always prepared for is asking the caregiver, why don't we make sure we have some cars and trucks today sitting out, or maybe an ambulance, or, let's set up something that looks like a hospital, because the whole purpose of this intervention is to assist the caregiver and the child to talk about the trauma, to process the trauma so that they can heal from that experience. Next slide. So child-parent relationship therapy is a play-based intervention. Remember, we talked about it a little bit earlier, where you're giving the caregiver homework assignments where they're doing play-based activities with the child during special playtime. And the goal of CPRT is to really strengthen the quality of that parent-child relationship, and also to build the caregiver self-efficacy, that they can connect with their kid in a really positive way. So parents are taught very specific skills. They're basically taught specific play-based intervention skills to use in the home environment. Next slide. And then the last evidence-based intervention I want to talk about is parent-child interaction therapy. This is a really effective intervention to utilize for children who have really pretty significant behaviors, very oppositional, very non-compliant. And the reason I love this intervention is it does teach compliance training, but that's not where we start. We actually start with the caregiver working with the child on rebuilding their attachment and relationship. So the very first phase of this treatment intervention is teaching the caregiver how to play with the child, how to be present with the child, how to reinforce the positive behaviors the kid is already displaying. And then the second phase of treatment is actually assisting the caregiver with setting healthy boundaries and rules for the child, and then also helping them through those processes. Okay, next slide. So that's the end of today's presentation, and these are some resources and references related to the slides that we discussed earlier, and I'll give it back over to Dr. Raymer so we can answer some questions you may have.
Great, thank you so much, Susan. That was fantastic. We have about, I think, 5 or 6 minutes for general questions, and I see some of them are starting to trickle in the Q&A, and I know there's more than 80 of you out there, so please get those questions in quickly so we can get to them. I want to start with just a general question. Some of your slides were talking about preparation, about things you can do beforehand, that sort of practice session. But then my sense is a lot of what you went over is learning how to think on your feet as well. So can you talk about the balance between how much work you should put in beforehand versus how much you should just prepare for whatever comes your way?
That's a great question. Well, flexibility is super important, for sure, being able to follow that parent and child's lead. When I'm doing any kind of intervention like PCIT, for example, I know what I'm supposed to do in that intervention because it's a very scripted intervention. And I know that this session, we're supposed to do these specific things, but I may get into the session and realize, like I had a caregiver last week call me and say, we can't do PCIT today because my kid's having a tantrum. No, don't cancel your session. Like, this is a beautiful opportunity for us to work through it. And so I was able to get her engaged and get her on, and we were able to work through that, but I couldn't jump straight into my intervention that I'd planned because the parent and the child were in a different space. And so we spent that time kind of regulating the caregiver. We, went back to some of those attachment activities. So you definitely want to know what you hope to accomplish based on goals and objectives of the child and the family, but also be flexible enough to move with them during the session.
Great, and a question in on the Q&A from Mark Wollett. What kinds of programs do you suggest for a 14-year-old with school refusal and retreats into online games? Can you use Minecraft to draw him out to rebuild social interactions?
Absolutely. Actually, that's a great question. I work with a lot of adolescents as well. And I have one kiddo that he was 15, really struggled, like you said, school refusal, also really struggled isolating, severe depression, was having some thoughts of suicide. And we actually got him engaged, and there was a gaming club at school. And he was like, I'd do that because then I don't have to talk to anybody. And so we got him engaged, and actually he blossomed. Like he really enjoyed these interactions that he had with the kids in that virtual environment, which then translated into the high school setting because these kids actually went to school with him. So actually, virtual gaming can be a very therapeutic intervention for children who don't typically feel comfortable in social situations.
Great. So from the biomedical perspective, there are certain problems that just are not that amenable to telehealth. You know, abdominal pain, for example, you just can't really do much there. Are there certain behavioral health diagnoses or situations like child protective services kind of things where you think telehealth is not a great solution?
So that's a great question. We would definitely say for individuals that have significant psychosis, telehealth is not the model of practice for them. They just really have a difficulty distinguishing between reality and fiction. And so this really confuses those individuals. So we definitely want to make sure that the diagnosis that we're working with is appropriate for telehealth. There are some level 3 children on the spectrum that I would say their behaviors are much too intense, and their ability to attune and be engaged is not where we want it to be for them to be effectively supported in a telehealth practice model. But for a large majority of the diagnoses that we serve out of the DSM-5, telehealth is adapted really well for that. Now, CPS cases, we actually get a ton of referrals from DCS for PCIT, which, as I mentioned, is a great intervention. Of course, parents do need to be prepared that that is part of the intake process. There are times that I have to breach confidentiality, and it would be if I see that you're harming your child or your child's harming someone else or going to hurt themselves. And so just making sure that caregivers understand that on the front end as well.
Great. And you mentioned a lot of practical troubleshooting techniques there. What do you do if the child just walks out of the session? Is there ever a point where you just kind of abort or just continue the session with the parent only?
That's a great question. That happens actually quite a lot, especially for younger children. First, we want to try to re-engage the child because we really do want them to be part of that intervention. So I might ask the parent or caregiver, let's go see what he's doing. And I'll ask the caregiver to kind of follow the kid and then engage in whatever it is that the child's doing to try to draw them back in. Sometimes I just spend that time with the caregiver because oftentimes I realize the caregiver needs those supports as well. And then I might even ask the caregiver, let's pretend like we're playing a game and let's be really silly and loud. And then all of a sudden, here's the kid. They come back in. What are y'all doing? Well, come here and we'll tell you, right? So there's ways to kind of re-engage the child, but there are going to be times where the kid's just done. And if that's totally fine. And we're just going to connect with that caregiver and keep the momentum going to support that caregiver.
And I'm going to sneak in 2 more questions before we finish. You mentioned a couple of interesting configurations where you have maybe the caregiver on audio and the child not involved. Can you describe that a little bit more?
Sure. So in parent-child interaction therapy, it is a parent coaching technique, which means that the caregiver actually wears a headset and the child can't hear what we're saying. And a lot of that is because what I'm doing is coaching up the parent's behavior. If the parent says, oh, I really like the way you're sitting in the chair, then in the earpiece, I tell the caregiver, oh, really great labeled praise. And so I'm really reinforcing the parent's behavior, and it's not necessarily important for the child to hear those pieces. Also in PCIT, there are times in the phase 2 of the intervention where we're directing the caregiver through a compliance piece. And I basically need to tell the caregiver how to manage the tantrum and behavior, and it's not necessary for the child to hear those specific parts. But outside of PCIT, the majority of the therapeutic interventions that I do with parents and children don't have the headphones. I do use headphones with older children, though, because it creates this safety net for them and enhances the ability for the things to be confidential. And so I do encourage that for older children.
Great. And I'm going to finish with kind of a philosophical question. I was surprised to see in a lot of your slides going through the evidence base that the references were from 2010, 2011, 2018, which by my math is well before COVID-19. So does that mean that this has been a movement of the field really all along and that we should just kind of accept this as where we're going and not be so apprehensive about these changes?
That's such a great question. Actually, telehealth services is not a new model of practice. It's been around for a very long time. Many social workers specifically have been very nervous about that platform for good reason around HIPAA confidentiality and compliance. And we do always need to think about those things. But for example, in my practice, we've been doing telehealth for 7 years. So this wasn't new for us. We actually were kind of prepared for COVID when it happened because we were already utilizing it in practice. And as you'll see in the literature, evidence-based interventions and the use of telehealth practice really goes way before COVID. And the research shows that it is just as effective an intervention as face-to-face. And so I think what we're seeing is that although it was always there, so many people were afraid to engage in that telehealth programming. And when they were thrust into it, many of them started to see, oh, this isn't as bad as I thought. It really is kind of a fear and needing more support around feeling prepared and equipped to manage that telehealth world.
Great, thank you so much. I have one favor to ask of our staff. If we could bring up Susan's last slide. I think she volunteered to put her contact info there. That would be wonderful to just display there. And I just want to say thanks. That was a wonderful presentation and a great way to close out the series. And just for the last couple of minutes, I'll turn it back over to May to end our session.
Thank you, Dr. Ramers, and thank you, Dr. Elswick, for that wonderful presentation. As Dr. Ramers said, this is our last telehealth hack. So I wanted to thank all the TRCs for the help preparing this. Thank you to Asper for actually launching this back in 2020. Thank you to all of our wonderful speakers who have participated in the hack. A special thank you to Dr. Ramers for his wonderful moderation facilitation through our hack series. And thank you to everyone who has attended one of these hacks. We really appreciate you being interested in the information that we provided and that you've shown up for these different webinars we've offered. So with that, we are ending the series. Thank you again for participating on this. The recording for this webinar will be made available on the Telehealth Resource Center website, as well as the PowerPoint. Once again, thank you to all of our speakers. A special thank you to Dr. Elswick and Dr. Ramers for a great session today. And thank you everyone for attending. Have a great day and stay safe.